All right. We're going to give this a try again. It's been a few years. I'm going to read this book, at least begin it. It's a book I found at the thrift store. I always like looking for old books. This one is 1928 was its publication. Anything later I tend not to look at. I like 30s and before. Give an interesting perspective on the past. Anyway, this book is called The Training of an American. Written and published in 1928, so I thought this should be pretty interesting. How do we train an American? Why would an American need training? So we're going to check this out. There's a picture here of a Mr. Anderson Page, born 1790, died in 1884. He is the grandfather of Walter Page, who I believe this book is about, and a familiar spirit of the old place, in quotes. This photograph was taken on his 94th birthday. Look, there he is. Old Dodger. All right, let's find out what this book is about. Here's the full title page. The Training of an American. The Early Life and Letters of Walter H. Page, who was born in 1855 and died in 1913 during the Great Reset era. Okay. Preface. Let's find out what we're about to get into. The purpose of this book is to complete the biography of Walter H. Page. The materials concerning Mr. Page's work as ambassador were so abundant and of such transcendent interest that they absorbed practically all of the 2 volumes originally assigned for his Life and Letters. The author was therefore forced in his original publication to compress the 58 years preceding the London embassy into the merest sketch. But for Mr. Page's life in his own country was of great interest and of great significance. Above all, it was an era that witnessed the transformation of a backward Civil War South into a progressive part of a united country. In this rebirth of ancient commonwealths, Walter Page himself played an important part. It seems appropriate that the materials concerning these activities, as well as Mr. Page's views on American life, the men and happenings of his own time, and the thoughts on literature and human progress, which directed his career and ultimately found expression in an international field, should be used in a final volume. There are perhaps half a dozen sentences which repeat statements in the previous work. This, for the sake of giving symmetry and completeness to the present narrative. With these slight exceptions, the book is new. In taking leave of the subject, the author wishes to thank the many friends and relatives of Mr. Page who have assisted the enterprise. And then he lists all those folks. Lots of them. Contents page. All Roman numerals. Yeah. There's a list of illustrations here. And now here we begin. The Training of an American. Chapter 1. The Old Place. Part 1. Our family, Walter Page once wrote in a reminiscent mood to his sons, has been a sturdy one to our knowledge for 150 years. At times it has been distinguished. Men of unusual qualities came now and then, and sturdy men almost always. It is a strong stock. My own acquaintance with them now reaches over 4 generations, including your own generation. The oldest one that I personally knew, my grandfather, your great-grandfather, was a strong character, a vigorous personality. He married the strongest woman he knew, I suspect. Surely she was robust in body and in character. I recall her as a strong woman. Her slaves loved but feared her. Her children held her in a sort of awe. She was positive. Nothing could be more significant than the adjectives Page uses in describing his ancestors. They were sturdy, strong, vigorous, robust, positive. These are not the qualities which the conventional Southerner attributes to his forebears. He rather likes to think of them as chivalrous, brave, courtly, polished, dignified. That Page did not first of all identify himself with such virtues gives an immediate insight into his character. He was not the traditional Southerner of song and story, nor did his family resemble the romantic type that almost dominates the scene in Southern literature. Page went even further in his modest disclaimer. Not only was he not the traditional Southerner, but he insisted that few Southerners ever were. Always an image breaker, he loved to dissipate prevailing misconceptions of Southern life. And one of the most absurd, in his opinion, was that highly sentimentalized picture of his native country which for several generations held sway over the American mind. The American stage, which for nearly a century had found the Southern plantation a particularly sympathetic theme. The American songwriter, in more recent years the motion picture, had done their part in enchanting the departed glory of the Southern states. The result was that merely to mention the Southern home called up a definite and somewhat standardized mental image. The central figure was a beautiful old house with porches covered in honeysuckle, seated in the midst of thousands of acres of plantation, usually with the cotton in full bowl, above which appeared the heads of hundreds of contented and languidly working black men. Moonlight, the songs of the darkies in their distance, the flitting forms of beautiful maidens clad in rough skirts, their hair falling about their shoulders in ringlets, handsome, brilliant cavaliers bending over their hands, old gentlemen in black garments and black stocks, walking with stately, meditative tread, lovely white-haired matrons smiling indulgently upon the benignant scene, colored mammies, coaches, and four in coats of arms, which were the essentials in the portrait. The average gentleman of this society looked with scorn upon the commercialists of the North. Labor he despised with a genuinely aristocratic fervor. Fox hunting, cockfighting, and gambling were the chosen occupations of his leisure. And nearly all his time was leisure. Honor, especially the honor of women of his caste, were almost as much a ritual as the Anglicanism he professed in religion. If to his manly virtues he added a propensity to run into debt, to drink hard liquor to excess, and to let all business concerns go to the dogs, these were merely the heroic failings which, after all, added the necessary touches to the gentlemanly ideal. The Southerner had thus become the finest product of American manhood. The Southern woman, the complete expression of womanly virtue and beauty. Southern plantation life, the perfection of American culture and domestic delight. The happiest fortune that could befall an American was evidently to be born in this society. This happy fortune, however, was not the fate of Walter Page. In certain sections, along the Potomac and James River in Virginia or the rice bottomlands of South Carolina, such a social organization or something resembling it did not exist. But there were few Westovers in the North Carolina region. Accurately to understand Page's more realistic surroundings, another misconception must be abandoned. the poor white has played a role as important as the Virginia Cavalier in the creation of the imaginary South. The average American insists on regarding the Southern organization as consisting of three rigidly defined strata: the plantation gentleman, the white vagabond who hung in ignorance and poverty upon his skirts, and the black helot. In recent years, the best Southern historians themselves have dispelled this illusion. Southern whites were not automatically assignable to two groups: tidewater gentlemen and social derelicts. The first class, if it ever existed, in its most romantic form, had an extremely limited membership. That there was another order, variously known as poor whites, crackers, hillbillies, and indeed true. But these unfortunates have figured too extensively in accepted descriptions of Southern life. The fact, too, generally overlooked, is that there was a third group, resembling rather the first than the last in mind and manners, yet distinctly separate from both. This was the great class of sober living and thrifty proprietors. Their possessions were more frequently farms than plantations, and some of them rather small ones. They cultivated their lands themselves, frequently working their own plow, like industrious New Englanders. Usually they had a few slaves, anywhere from 1 to a dozen. Their establishments were well and neatly kept. Their toil yielded a sufficient income to provide most comforts and certain luxuries. Their sons and daughters had a good schooling, and occasionally instruction in the highest branches at a denominational college. Their lives were plain, even commonplace, but they were honest, intelligent, hard-working, frugal, above all religious. Their religion itself, however, set them apart from the fine aristocrats of the coastal plain who, for the most part, were churchmen, that is, Anglicans, while the farmer class were overwhelmingly Baptists and Methodists with a generous proportion of Presbyterians. Compared with the stately Episcopal ritual of Virginia, their manifestations possessed a zeal which itself expressed the earnestness of their lives. Their attitude toward politics and the overshadowing Southern institution also marked them as a distinct class. They were Jeffersonians, and they remained Jeffersonians long after the statesman of Monticello had ceased to be the great patron saint of the Southern states. In the political battles preceding the Civil War, they followed the banner of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster rather than that of John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis. They accepted slavery indeed, and the time came when they took the battlefield of its defense, but their emotions on the subject were not fanatical. Their devotion to the Federal Union, at least until the final break, was always a cherished influence in their lives. That their slaves were far better treated than those, at least of the lower cotton regions, is the testimony of most observers. Especially, they had a Christian, perhaps a Methodist interest in treating their black dependents as human beings. Unnoticed, as have been these Southern farmers by the poets and romancers, simple as were their living habits and manners, their character was clean, substantial, vigorous. They were very numerous, too. Far more numerous than the type that has almost monopolized public attention. And in the judgment of the historian, they constituted the economic backbone and the real moral fiber of the Southern states. From this class came many Southern leaders. In a certain sense, Woodrow Wilson belonged to it. From this class it came Walter Page. Precisely what connection existed between the North Carolina Pages and the great Virginia Pages is not known. That a North Carolina Page should have become ambassador to Great Britain during the Great War, and that a Virginia Page, Thomas Nelson, should have become ambassador to Italy during the same crisis, or that both men should have made a name in letters, though in different fields, would naturally persuade the followers of Galton to trace their origin to a common source. The two men, good friends in mature life, frequently discussed their possible relationship. They even used to address each other as cousin, but neither could produce the facts that justified the salutation. A significant bit of biological evidence came to light one day, however, when Thomas Nelson Page met for the first time Walter Page's father. Walter's father looked enough like Papa to be his brother, Thomas Nelson wrote to his family. That the North Carolina Pages came from Virginia is a fact. The first existing bit of family history is the record of the marriage bonds given by Lewis Page to Sally Justice in Lunenburg Country, Virginia, on February 13th, 1778. This Lewis Page was Walter Page's great-grandfather. His first name suggests an association with the Lewis family of Virginia, to which belonged the famous Meriwether Lewis, who, with William Clark, blazed the trail across the prairies and the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast. The suggestion has no solid basis, for there are no records, not even any family traditions for such ancestry, yet to linger on a possible connection between the Pages and these heroic pioneers is a great temptation, for the quality that in 1805 sent Meriwether Lewis across the wilderness in precisely the quality that up to the present generation has been an outstanding one in the Page family. The tenderness of Walter Page himself for the moist earth was that of a lover for his mistress. The achievements of the Page tribe have invariably resulted from their intimate dealings with nature, and it is this characteristic that led Lewis Page away from his Virginia home and caused him to begin life anew in an uninhabited forest in North Carolina. It is not surprising that his family records disappeared in the process, for the land was still a frontier, full of deer and wolves and Indians. Another thing that Lewis Page apparently lost was the accepted religion of Virginia. The primeval accents of Methodism were more adapted to his new buckskin life than the church in which he had been bred. The census of 1790 places Lewis Page in the Tabbs Creek district of North Carolina and says that his family consisted of one free Pole and one black Pole. His apparent ownership of one slave, his manifest fondness for the woods, his religion, his Virginian origin, and his marriage in Lunenburg County are almost all the available information concerning him. His son Anderson, born in 1790 in Granville Country, just over the borderline from Virginia, probably the Tabbs Creek district, referred to in this census, is a much more clearly defined character. He belonged to the substantial farmer class, as distinguished from the cavalier, but his possessions indicate a considerable state of prosperity. He owned a farm of 1,200 acres and operated with from 30 to 50 slaves, a number which would make him a not unworthy figure on a Virginia plantation. He did an extensive carrying business from Wake County to the great tobacco and cotton mart in Petersburg, Virginia, transporting not only his own farm product, but that of his neighbors. Anderson showed that interest in education, which has been a consistent Page trait for several generations. As far back as 1832, he established a primary school at his Wake County home, Oakey Mount, for the instruction of his own large family and nearby children. It is not surprising, therefore, that 4 of his 8 sons and 3 of his daughters received something in the nature of an academic education. His son, Allison Francis Page, Walter's father, born in 1824 at the old place, again displayed the migratory instinct. The The region in Frank Page's boyhood had become more populated than in his father's early days, and was the scene of many preposterous farms and settlements. That's prosperous. But an enticing tang of the primeval still lingered about it. A long stretch of pine forest and sand full of birds, with few roads worthy of the name, and with an occasional house of which that of Anderson Page was the largest. As a boy, hard work was Frank Page's daily routine. "Recall a fact like this," said Walter Page, describing Wake County conditions at that time. "My father, as a boy, went with my grandfather's caravan of wagons loaded with cotton all the way from Wake County to Petersburg, Virginia, to sell it. Over miserable roads, camping by the roadside at night, and taking a week to make the journey either way. And in those days, hogsheads of tobacco were rolled from Granville County to market at Petersburg." From all that can be learned, however, this life in the open air was entirely congenial. Above everything else, the journey lay through the pine woods. What the sound of the sea was to the Greeks, the peace and understanding of the valleys and mountains and lakes to Wordsworth and his companions, the stern hillsides of New England to the Puritan pioneers, and all the forests. All this the forests were to Frank Page. The great stretch of pine that begins in Virginia and ranges as far south as northern Florida swept through that part of North Carolina in which the Page clan found its root. Frank Page was never content outside this. His natural medium, below a floor of sand covered deep with pine needles, above the stately expanse of perennial green. There was nothing in this country that Frank Page did not love. It became the basis of his life and the captain of all his occupations and enjoyments. Matter of fact is a term his old friends sometimes use in describing him. Yet his love of the forest, his preference for the life of lumberman to that of a farmer, his father's occupation, shows that even if he lacked the spirit of poetry, at least he had the impulse of adventure. And here's a picture of Allison Francis Page, father of Walter Page, born 1824, died 1899. There he is. All right. Frank Page himself was almost as lithe and outstanding as his own pines. He was 6'5" and 1/2 inches in height, yet, again, like his pines, though he was tall, he was spare. His active outdoor existence had produced a physical development that was exclusively bone and muscle. His face, bearded in later years, contained no superfluous flesh. Its important structures stood out boldly: the long forehead, the deep eye sockets, the quiet, meditative eyes, the generous nose, the large ears pressing closely to the skull, the great, erect head, were an appropriate covering for the qualities of character that guided his life. Of these, perhaps the most abiding were energy, determination, conscience, all compacted with a sane and homely idealism, characteristics that, in him at least, existed in the same nature with gentleness and unselfishness, interest in the happiness of his family and his neighbors. That his religion possessed a rugged Old Testament virility and perhaps an Old Testament harshness was true. His elemental mind was not disturbed by the refinements of theologians. God was God, heaven was heaven, hell was hell, and in all three he most fervently believed. His Methodism was thus of the most authentic Wesleyan brand. No Negro could curse and remain in Frank Page's employ. Theater-going, dancing, dicing, and card-playing were likewise forbidden. Strong drink was his most cherished abomination. He was a prohibitionist 3/4 of a century before the Great Refusal found its shrine in the federal Constitution. These convictions, however, were merely his rules of conduct. They did not produce, in his case, an unsympathetic attitude. His nature was essentially yielding and congenial. He had an exuberance of humor. He could laugh, and laugh long and loud. His laughter, indeed, still echoes in the regions of his old home. A phrase used frequently in describing him is big-hearted. His vast native intelligence has also left its mark. On the business side, it made him, in after years, a rich man, builder of railroads, the creator of new towns, the pioneer who opened to settlement great areas of his native state. In its public aspects, as this was Walter Page's chief boyhood recollection of his father, the same intelligence and this deep devotion to his country persuaded him to independent opinions not especially popular at the time. But the height of wisdom when viewed in retrospect, though Frank Page owned slaves himself, he regarded the institution with abhorrence. In this he was Jeffersonian, and in most other political ways he was a leader in his district of the group that regarded the slavery discussion of the 50s with dismay. For Frank Page was not a sectionalist, indeed, not first of all a Southern man, at least in political conceptions. He was a nationalist, a unionist. In the disturbing era preceding the Civil War, he expressed these ideas with the utmost freedom and eloquence. His own hearth was an open forum in which anti-slavery sentiment and loyalty to the federal government were the watchwords. These discussions became the earliest in Walter Page's memories. Though reared in a Southern home, the atmosphere of his childhood was that of allegiance to an expansive and united country. And that's the end of part 1. And I got things to do, so I'll see you around on the next one. Ciao.